So we've been talking to Christians who are interested in Bitcoin, maybe have heard about it, but are skeptical of it. A lot of Christians associate Bitcoin with bad people doing bad things, drug dealers, criminals, mafia lords, these kinds of guys. And so what we've been trying to say is that, yeah, just like anything else, not least the dollar, bad people and sinful people can use Bitcoin sinfully, and they have done so. But what we are trying to say is that in a lot of ways, Christians should be particularly interested in Bitcoin because it actually responds to human sinfulness. It's designed to deal as best as we can to deal with human sin, especially human sinfulness around questions of money. What happens when some people have a lot more power than everybody else to control money? Well, Christians should not be surprised to read history and see that over and over and over again in history, people abuse that power and they use it to benefit themselves. It is very unusual for people to resist the temptation to create money for themselves and their friends, not for everybody else, with everything that happens downstream of that. So we want to take a little bit of time today to kind of go through some of the sinful effects of inflation or monetary debasement. Inflation, printing more money in the hopes, purportedly, of causing people to go out and spend money to consume in the economy. That is the overwhelmingly dominant position of most economists and most government financial institutions. They say this is a good thing. You can argue that they are nefarious, they're malicious in doing this. Maybe some of them are. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is well-intentioned. They're trying to help. And they'll say, and I'm sure many of them do mean, that they want to help people and they want to help the economy. The fear under this form of economics for about the last 100 years, the fear is that if we encourage people to save, or we at least allow saving to take its normal course, then people will just sit on their money and they won't spend it. And that will cause really serious depressions in the economy and people will lose their work. We have to stimulate the economy. So this is where we get the idea of the stimulus check. If we just print money and send it to everybody, then they'll go out and they'll spend money, and isn't that great? We're helping the economy. But actually, even if your intentions are really good, biblically, you have not got very far in terms of ethics. What is good and right? What does it really mean to obey God? Almost everybody doing all kinds of sinful, evil things has some kind of good intention behind it. There's some kind of greater goal they're shooting for. They're trying to help people. They really think they're doing it. Even the most wicked tyrants and despots in human history have often had good intentions and may have been very genuine in those good intentions. You see this all over the Bible. God, when he talks about worship, how he wants to be worshiped, he says, here's how you worship me. I don't care how much something might help you. If you want to draw pictures of me and put them in the middle of your church, God says, no, you can't do that. Israel at Mount Sinai created a golden calf, not because they had suddenly decided they hated God, but actually because they thought it was really helpful for them to worship God. And God says, you can't do that. Don't make images of me. We are in the Presbyterian world, and so we have the Westminster Confession and the Westminster Catechisms. At this point, it talks about how when God is being worshipped, he says what he wants to be done, regardless of your zeal or your good intentions. More broadly than worship, you also see in just ethics in general, doing good things, it's not enough to have good intentions. Jesus is always nailing the Pharisees because they rely so heavily on human tradition, building on top of God's commands. The Pharisees had wonderful intentions. They were trying to keep Israel pure. They were trying to recover Israel's holiness as a people so that they could finally deal with all of the social and political problems they were facing in their day. And so they add lots of rules to help them to obey God's rules. And Jesus is always going after them over this. He says, quotes the prophet Isaiah, these people draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus says what they are doing is abominable. They love human traditions more than what God has actually said. And so we need to be careful. You can't just wave the flag that says, oh, no, but these guys are experts. They work for these financial institutions. They have good intentions. We have these great theories about how it will help people. The real question is this actually a good thing or not? Is it wise to print all kinds of money that then gets unevenly distributed to people out in the economy, benefiting, of course, the people closely connected to the government, closely connected to financial institutions, before it benefits everybody else? This is what's called the Cantillon effect. Money printing never affects everybody at the same time and in the same way. It always helps some people before it helps other people. And this has happened over and over again in history. To kind of help us talk through some of these things, I thought it'd be interesting to talk through this book. This is by, I believe he's German. He's a German economist. I think he's Roman Catholic. Guido Hulsmann. He has written a book called The Ethics of Money Production, where he talks about kind of different theories of how money has been made, should be made, and different effects. And he has this interesting chapter called The Cultural and Spiritual Legacy of Fiat Inflation. And so this is kind of the most, for our purposes, the most practical section. How does this affect people when a state prints lots of money, whether we're talking about 1,000 years ago or we're talking about today? How does it affect people spiritually? How does it affect them morally? What kinds of things does it incentivize? All of us are familiar with unintended consequences of well-intentioned acts. We've all known parents who genuinely, I think, love their teenagers and would say they love them, but enable them to do all kinds of very destructive things because they don't want to say no. They don't want to do hard things. They don't want to deal with arguments. They don't want to deal with meltdowns. And so they keep enabling them to, do drugs or, do all kinds of wild and crazy stuff. And you can see the train wreck coming from 100 miles away, that actually this really isn't ultimately loving. This is unloving. There are lots of downstream effects. And if you constantly bail somebody out of the consequences of their own behavior, you are actually incentivizing more of it. And that's the same in the economy. He says that in his first paragraph, he says inflation, and inflation, we have to understand, doesn't just mean prices going up. That's how most people use that word inflation today. They say, the prices are going up. There's a lot of reasons prices could go up. Maybe a bomb fell on a big giant stack of widgets, and now there's a lot less widgets in the world. That will cause the price of those widgets to go up a lot because there's less of them. But that's not what we mean when we say inflation. Inflation is, maybe the better word for it is debasement, that the money has been watered down. We've printed a lot more money out of step with growth in the economy. So that's what he means. And he says inflation, speaking of it morally, is what happens when people increase the money supply by fraud, imposition, and breach of conduct. So he says in inflation or debasement, there's always some combination of these immoral activities. Fraud, you're deceiving people. Imposition, you're forcing them to accept money that they did not want to be using or would not have chosen to use if they would have known what you know. And breach of contract, they are not getting what they were promised or what was implied. And so he says it produces three characteristic consequences. It benefits the perpetrators at the expense of all the other money users. It allows the accumulation of debt beyond the level debts could reach on the free market. And it reduces the productivity of the market beyond what it would have reached on the free market because things become a lot more inefficient as people are chasing inflation around. A lot of people today, a lot of Christians are really concerned about debt and how much debt people are going into, how many people in our churches are going into deep debt. We all love Dave Ramsey. Lots of churches promote him. He rightly is concerned about how many Christians and how many people go into all kinds of crazy debt. Hulsmann is saying a world in which money is printed rapidly and unpredictably is incentivizing that debt. That debt didn't come out of nowhere. And he says all these other things that are built on top of it. He says that it leads to various kinds of institutions and habits. And so one of the first things he talks about is, what does this lead to? A world where some people can print lots of money that other people have to use. He said the first thing it leads to is that it causes the state to become hyper-centralized. This is the lifeblood of a state that is becoming more and more powerful and more controlling. If they didn't have the power to print money, they would have much less influence and much less control over normal people's lives. And this doesn't come, he says, with no expense, there's a trade-off here. He says centralized government becomes more powerful at the expense of local government and at the expense of institutions like the family. Christians should be concerned that the family be healthy. Family's not everything, of course. Family doesn't fix all the problems. But for most problems, for many problems, it is the closest to the problem, and it is the best way to deal with it because your family knows you, they've raised you, they have an eye on the situation. The more that problems are dealt with by further and further institutions, the more waste there's going to be, but also the more destruction there's going to be because they don't know you, they're far away from you. They could be easily co-opted and manipulated into choosing some people to win over other people. And he says this isn't just a modern phenomenon. This is something that was going on in the Middle Ages. He says, in the 17 and 1800s, a lot of what was behind the rise of nation states, was the ability to print money. They had come up with new ways to more efficiently control the money creation. And that is a lot of, he says, what was behind the nation state as it kind of became the dominating community for people to belong to. And they encourage this, It's not hard to find lots of stuff in the 17, 18, early 1900s about states trying to figure out how do we get people to make their patriotism and their allegiance to the giant nation the most dominant thing. John Dewey, the father of modern public education, he was very open about this. He was very clear that our goal in public education is to help young people move further away from their families and their loyalty to their family and more loyalty to the nation, to the state. The Prussian government, Germany, in the 17 and 1800s kind of developed these new models of efficient education. This later got adopted in most of the Western world of what is education for. Still, this is with us today, this idea that you are training to become a cog in the machine to serve the large nation, not necessarily your local community. It's very different than how education has normally been understood for most of human history. So he talks about that an inflationary system encourages centralized government and centralized control. But then he also talks about how inflation is also what enables much longer and much more destructive wars than would normally be possible. If a state wanted to fight a war, and it didn't have the power of printing money in its back pocket, there's only a couple of ways that it can pay for war. War is extremely expensive and generally extremely unpopular. People don't like having their kids get killed, especially for something that doesn't seem to affect them or that they don't really care about. People generally are not interested in fighting the wars of aristocrats against other aristocrats. So if you want to fight a war, the way you normally have to do it without inflation is you have to borrow money or you have to raise taxes. Raising taxes, of course, is very unpopular. People will only tolerate it for so long, especially if they don't see the point of the war for themselves and their families. And borrowing money, of course, you can't do it too much before your creditors come after you and you can't afford it anymore. And so he says inflation, the ability to print money, he says it doesn't cause war. It's not the only cause of war. Wars would happen and unjust wars would happen anyways without it. But he says they make them able to go on much longer and they make it much more destructive because you can print money to build weapons. You can print money to pay soldiers to go off and die in your wars. And so he says, again, this is an unintended consequence of something that perhaps has good intentions, but wouldn't happen normally if it didn't have the ability to do this.
To be clear, in our current system, the Treasury creates bonds and the Fed prints money to buy the bonds. So they still technically are borrowing the money. They're just borrowing it from an institution that has the ability to print.
Right, dollars. Yeah, and this is what's so crazy about the system that we're in, and it's hard to explain it to people because when you explain it, it sounds like it can't be real. The the Federal Reserve buys the debt, is kind of always there to pick up whatever debt no one else wants to buy. And basically, there's that video that was floating around a couple of years ago of one of the chairman of the Federal Reserve talking about how there's infinite money at the Federal Reserve. I think that was on an interview on 60 Minutes or something. That they basically have a bottomless checking account where they can just, always be topping up the government coffers. And everyone knows that you can't do that forever. You can't do that completely to infinity, but they get pretty close to that, and they push it as far as they can, and they get a long ways of the way there.
It obfuscates the money printing, right? Because the government can still say, "Whoa, we're just issuing bonds. We're taking on debt. We're not printing."
Right, and there's one or two steps that they put in between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve to kind of give this semblance of independence. Technically, it's not the Federal Reserve itself that goes out and buys the bonds. The Federal Reserve requires intermediary banks to go out and buy the bonds from the government, and then the Federal Reserve buys the bonds from the banks. So there is this kind of plausible deniability of like, oh no, look, these banks bought it. And then we just get that from them. This is Federal Reserves is what this is. But yeah, it's basically endless ability to spend money. I mean, it's like, if I've heard this illustration, if you went out to dinner with your friends and you had the ability to kind of print the money, and they didn't, that would benefit you a great deal. If I had this magic power to create more money whenever I wanted, to have a bottomless checking account like the federal government has, I don't think I could resist the temptation to go out and do all kinds of crazy and unproductive and destructive things with it. That would seem like a really wonderful thing to me. And I could tell myself the whole entire time, well, I have good intentions. I'm a good guy. I've learned a lot. I've been to school. I'm trying to help my family. I'm trying to help my neighborhood. But like Hulsmann is saying, there's all these downstream effects of these things that end up incentivizing, kind of like the parents with the teenager. They incentivize all kinds of really destructive things, and they allow them to go on way longer than they would normally. It can never go on forever. You can only fight against basic math for so long. You can only fight against God and reality for so long, but it's not good. And it allows for all kinds of destruction. He also talks about, he calls it a race to the bottom. He says that in a world where money is being printed all the time, he says institutions are incentivized, like businesses and banks, to go out and borrow a lot more money as quickly as possible before everyone else does. And so it encourages you to race around and take advantage of it as much as you can. And this, of course, is a big problem. It causes people to have to go out and do things that may or not be wise or may not work out. This was a lot of what was happening with the great financial crisis in 2008 and the years before that with housing. People, due to government policies and purportedly well-intentioned attempts to get more people to own houses, people were going and buying all kinds of real estate that they couldn't afford, had no real way to pay back. But it was kind of this, oh no, it's all going to work out fine. The prices will keep going up forever. Just go out and do it. It'll be fine to take out all this debt. And so people did all kinds of really crazy things. And eventually it stopped working and everything melted down. He talks about how businesses are the same. You're a businessman. You have tried to resist some of these temptations, although you could have taken advantage of many of these things to run out and take risks on things that maybe you wouldn't have normally if you didn't have lots of debt behind to back it up. I wonder if you've seen any of this in kind of the business world and how it encourages foolish decision-making in businesses.
All the time. Get offers all the time to take out a business line of credit and don't even require a personal guarantee. And what they're trying to stoke you to do is to expand your business and grow and hire more people and offer more products and services. And so you're getting this false signal in the midst of an economy that is maybe actually shrinking, but nominally things are growing, right, because of inflation. So I think as an entrepreneur, it's really confusing. It tells you, yeah, grow. Things are great right now. Take on the debt. There's nothing to lose. And then, of course, when the inevitable business cycle turns down, everybody goes out of business.
Right.
Except for the big players, which again, just serves to make the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which is the Cantillon effect that you were talking about originally.
Right. Yeah, and he talks about, too, he has this interesting section where he talks about how when businesses are so incentivized to do everything by debt and to take out more and more debt and to run around making investments all the time, he says, well, first of all, it requires you to be much more financially savvy. You have to spend a lot more time dealing with financialized products instead of actually working on your business or your family or your farm or whatever it is. You have to sit there and manage stocks and bonds and loans and all these things. But he also talks about how it really undercuts actual entrepreneurship. It undercuts actual independent business owners and leaders to where you really become an extension of the banking system. The banks and their loans and the Federal Reserve behind them really become the entrepreneurs. They're the ones that are making a lot of money. They're the ones that are going out trying new things. And he says effectively what happens as a businessman who's running around trying to get more debt to deal with all this is you become a kind of manager of somebody else's system, somebody else's instruments. And he says it seriously undermines a kind of, and he means this in a good way, an independent spirit of a businessman who's providing for his family, who's providing for his local community, providing for his employees. You don't do that as much. And he says it becomes very unusual to do those. And you actually have to work very hard to resist the temptation to be Mr. Debt Manager for the sake of a larger institution.
It also incentivizes you to not be as efficient as you could be. When you're swimming in a bunch of easy to get capital, you have this false sense of security that, oh, I can make payroll and it's not that bad that we're not closing enough deals this month or whatever because I still have liquidity.
Right.
But it eventually comes back to haunt you.
Right. Yeah. And it's like these things you could have been focusing on instead of, improving your business and making it something that more people in your community want.
Or not hiring somebody, even though you really want to.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a bummer to say, well, I can't hire Billy over here because we don't have the income for it right now. But ultimately, you will harm more Billys than not if you are running around hiring him when you really can't afford it. It'll eventually catch up with you.
This is the argument. Part of the argument they make for inflation is a business owner will choose to not hire somebody unless we kind of force the economy to grow and stoke them into doing it.
Right.
And that's bad because then we'll have less jobs. And
right.
We need more jobs to get elected, right?
Right.
So it's just, if the economy is sending you the signal that you shouldn't be growing right now because whatever product or service you're producing is not in demand, then it's the wrong signal to stoke you to produce more of it. But that's exactly what they do. And then that's what ends up causing the business cycle and people go out of business. And then all those people that had jobs lose their jobs. Right,
yeah. And the pain, kind of like a drug addict going through withdrawals, the pain of getting off of the debt delusion is ultimately a lot more destructive than if you had not ever had to go through the high before that. It would have been better just to kind of slowly chug your way through it and hire people as you were able than to have this burst of printed money to hire a bunch of people and then it all implodes and all the plans that everyone have along with
kicking the can down the road is less painful than taking the pain now.
Right. No, of course. And so in a way, it's the least painful path. It's the parents who enable the teenager to keep doing drugs or whatever, or to keep trashing their car. They don't want to deal with the pain of saying no. And there's pain in either case. The question is how much pain and when is it going to be? Well, it's more pain to enable destructive behavior and encourage it ultimately, even if for a time it feels better.
So in a sense, we're agreeing with them when they say, well, we have to have the inflation because otherwise things will get really bad.
Right.
It's like, well, yeah, it will get really bad, but that's kind of the point. Right,
yeah. And this is a function of being creatures in a fallen world who don't know everything and can't know everything. The pain of touching the stove is how you learn not to do it. And there's never going to be a perfect time on earth where people have perfectly figured out how to predict the future. If you knew how to perfectly control and predict the future, you wouldn't need to save money. You wouldn't need to, think about retirement. You could just know exactly what's coming. You know what medical bills you're going to have, how many children you're going to have, whatever it is. But that can't happen because part of being human means not knowing the future. Only God knows the future. And so saving money and being able to reliably predict kind of what my money is going to do into the future is a good way of dealing with human limitation of knowledge. This is why something like Bitcoin is so important, is because it is predictable in terms of how much of it will be printed, so to speak. Bitcoin is being printed, quote unquote, printed digitally at a predictable declining rate until eventually no more Bitcoin will be printed. And everyone can look and see and know exactly when that's going to happen. You can know that someone is not going to next week, in a fit of mania, print twice as many Bitcoin because they had a great idea of how to help their friends and give more jobs to them. This is the killer feature of Bitcoin, is that you can't print more of it. So anyways, I think that's a good place to stop for now. Next time, we'll keep going on this chapter, and we'll talk kind of more about what he talks about debt and people becoming burdened with debt, especially young people, but even how that affects older people too, of living in a society where people are taking on way more debt than they can control. But I think that's a good place for us to stop for today, about how sin can be something that is destructive even when the intentions are good.